Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank the Indian History Congress Committee for inviting me to speak in this webinar. In this difficult corona times, this digital media has enabled us to academically interact, and I hope in the coming year we would be able to meet in person. I hope the situation would definitely improve. Today, I am going to speak on hunter-gatherers in historical South India. I have divided my talk into two parts. The first part gives an introductory note and addresses some of the issues related to archaeological research. The second part focuses on the hunter-gatherers in general and in historical South India. The category of hunter-gatherers refers to communities that depended on hunting wild animals and collecting plant foods. Sometimes they are also referred to as foragers. In human history, hunter-gatherers cannot be treated as unchanging category, and the construction of this category has been questioned by researchers. For example, Myers 1988. Hunter-gatherers in reality might have existed as diverse types depending upon the space-time or cultural context in which they existed. So these variations in the hunter-gatherer adaptations in prehistoric as well as historical time should be taken into account, and we cannot treat them as a constant monolithic category. One of the branches of hunter-gatherer studies concentrates on the so-called scheduled tribes as classified during the colonial period and known as Adivasis living in the marginalized areas and in the forest territories of India. There are documentations and studies available on these communities from the colonial period, and even our early Indian literature and medieval literature do talk about these communities. There are documentation studies and available on these communities in several for several regions of India. I'm not going to present any overview on these studies. Mainly, anthropologists have studied these communities, and archaeologists have undertaken ethnographic and ethnoarchaeological investigations on these groups in order to understand their archaeological record as well as their ethnohistorical component. D.D. Kosambi, in his book The Culture and Civilization of Ancient India, in historical outline says, when there are forests close by, one may still see people like Katkaris of Western Ghats or Mundas and Warans of Bihar who are barely out of food gathering stage. Here, Kosambi talks about food gathering as a stage. Such marginal tribesmen are dying out because of disease, drunkenness, the disappearance of forests, and the advancement of civilization and of money lenders. So these forest communities, or otherwise known as tribal population, they still exist, and they have been facing a lot of problems because of modernization and globalization and other developments. And I have done some research on the Palians in Varshanada Andipatti Hills in Madurai region. I myself know how they are facing problems to carry out their livelihood. The hunter-gatherers of prehistoric period are studied by archaeologists based on material cultural remains. The Mesolithic period witnessed widespread occupation of hunter-gatherers in various ecozones of the Indian subcontinent or South Asia. The microlithic hunter-gatherers of South Asia existed in distinct contexts from the late Pleistocene to early Holocene age. There are researchers in the recent past pushing the date of introduction of microlithic technology and their hunter-gatherer adaptation right up to 45,000 BP. For example, the research done by Vishnupriya Basak, Sheila Mishra, Petraglia, Corey Setter, Parth Chauhan, and others. I'm not going to list the complete scholars here. The Ganga Valley sites of Mahadaha, Damdama, Sarai Nahar Rai, and Bahur in Rajasthan, and several other sites in India have produced evidence for hunter-gatherer occupation in the late Pleistocene, early Holocene onwards. That is before the beginning of Indus Valley civilization. The paintings found at Bhimbetka, some of these paintings have been attributed to the Mesolithic context. In Sri Lanka also, we have a lot of evidence for these hunter-gatherers living in various ecozones. However, with the onset of early farming communities of the Neolithic and Chalcolithic cultures, the conditions of the hunter-gatherers appear to have changed. The northwestern part of the Indian subcontinent, with Mehergarh as an important site, and the Ganga Valley have so far produced very early evidence for agrarian beginnings in South Asia. The early Mesolithic hunter-gatherers seems to have constituted a base population of the Indian subcontinent and in South Asia as a whole. While migration theories have stressed on Dravidian and Aryan speakers and their origin, the hunter-gatherer population and their history have not been given due importance, in my opinion. Similarly, there is evidence of Austroasiatic populations in eastern India and northeastern India, and they have not received due attention. Any attempt to understand the peopling of the Indian subcontinent should begin at least with the understanding of late Pleistocene, early Holocene hunter-gatherers and their continuity and further cultural developments. It appears that there is a selective focus on certain categories or civilizations or cultures such as Aryan, Dravidians, or Indus civilization. Archaeologists who attempt to understand the past societies tend to focus on the material culturally rich communities or urban forms. The discovery of Indus civilization and its study has dominated archaeological research in India in the 20th century. In the nationalist perspective, the Indus civilization was seen as an achievement of ancient India, and this civilization has been focused much on school education and in college education as part of awareness programs also. Now, I would like to highlight the recent developments and awareness among the public and the interested individual with regard to the studies of on the past. In the popular understanding, the Indus civilization has become a yardstick for measuring the achievement of any civilization or culture or archaeological findings in India. If any archaeological site is excavated or researched, people tend to seek comparison and association with the Indus civilization, at least in certain parts of the country, for example, in Tamil Nadu. In the light of Kiladi excavations in Tamil Nadu and Pattanam in Kerala, there are parallels drawn in public understanding over their relationship with the Harappan or Indus Valley civilization. But these cultures are separated by vast space and time. It has become a trend in some parts of India to use the Right to Information Act and the legal system to undertake archaeological excavation at specific sites and for seeking publication of archaeological reports in the recent past. Excavations are conducted based on popular demand, and there are court cases seeking directives to excavate archaeological sites and protect and preserve archaeological sites and monuments. And sometimes research is carried out rather than problem-oriented uh, questions and research questions formulated by archaeologists, and they are directed by the public interest and public requirement. One of the issues highlighted in these discussions has been that not enough attention has been paid to excavate archaeological sites in Tamil Nadu or other cultures, and a high degree of importance is paid to the Indus civilization. Padaya, in his recent paper, has argued, Professor Padaya, who is from Deccan College, that archaeological studies need to focus on researching regional culture. He uses the concept subaltern to focus on the off-sites or small sites. The title of his paper has been Tall Talk About Heritage Management, Need for a Subaltern Approach to Archaeological Record in India. He says the subaltern approach to archaeological record, taking into account what are called non-sites or off-sites, and its investigation at the regional levels hold important lessons for Indian archaeology at the level of research domain and heritage management. Similarly, Shanti Papu uses the terminology Taj syndrome to highlight the importance given to major archaeological monuments rather than fragile prehistoric sites. D.D. Kosambi, Subbarao, and several other researchers have highlighted the need for understanding the cultural diversity of India for developing a deep understanding of Indian history and its past. While major civilization and cultures have been the point of attraction in archaeological studies, hunter-gatherers or history of rural settlements have not been receiving due focus. Now there is an increased demand for focusing on the cultures, archaeological cultures of different regions. Against this background, I like to argue for a regional archaeological studies and for village histories, we need to pay more attention using all kinds of sources, including archaeological materials. In the policy matters, I feel we need to allot more financial assistance for understanding archaeological cultures of different regions of India. I would like to argue that the regional socio-political conditions have always influenced the subject of historical research among academic and outside academia in various contexts. What kind of subject is chosen, what kind of site is excavated, they are all dictated by several factors in different regions of India. I do not intend to question the importance of the Indus civilization. However, what is argued here is to understand the peopling of India, cultures and cultural developments in various regions of India need to be given due and special attention. In terms of early Pleistocene and early Holocene hunter-gatherers, more emphasis needed to understand their culture and adaptation. The archaeological establishment and institutions need to focus more on science-oriented research and application-oriented studies. This is where we need to give more financial allotment on the part of the government in undertaking very high-end science-oriented archaeological research. However, I do not perceive science as a messiah, and we need to be careful in the interpretation of scientific results and their meanings. Because we know, under using the genetic studies, a lot of interpretations are presented nowadays, and there are problems. And we need to understand the history and the cultural context before using the scientific results. I would like to point out the recent popular media reports about the scientific study of Harappan diet. Harappan society covered a vast area and it had a diverse population. Therefore, just based on few sample studies, we can't generalize. This is a problem when we highlight science reports through the media reports. We need to highlight to the public that this sample is small and it cannot be drawn cannot be used to draw a broader generalization, and we need to be careful. I also feel that archaeology and heritage studies need to be given more space in history departments in the colleges and universities across India. And also, we need more interactions and between archaeologists and historians, and the scholars have been talking about this, but this has not really happening. And we need to combine these disciplines to formulate, to understand ancient and medieval Indian history. I also would like to stress that medieval archaeology and colonial period archaeology is also very important, because many of the archaeological departments tend to focus only on ancient India. This is one of the areas we need to develop more understanding, and we need to focus for more on the medieval archaeological issues and landscape archaeology and other perspectives. Archaeologists have always struggled to identify cultures and civilization from the material culture. This morning, Professor Rajan Gurukal clearly highlighted how problematic it is to create cultures based on the evidence from ceramics from a particular sites. Archaeologists have created cultures based on material cultural remains, and their identities have been problematic. But there are also problems because archaeologists, like philosophers, it is said they used to search for a dog in a dark room, searching for a black cat. Archaeologists tend to look at the material culture closely. By looking at their attributes, they try to develop an understanding of a culture which is very complex. Suppose if an archaeologist work in couple of sites, it is very difficult to express the culture or the material culture that he or she excavates and other people to understand that cultural expression. I think this is where we need to work on to include digital archaeology or artificial intelligence, because we have excavated so many sites across India. If we can really use artificial intelligence to define these cultures, we have a lot of cultures like painted graver culture, Harappan culture. Sometimes, archaeologists work on based on their own cognitive skill, which is limited, and also each individual has his or her own subjective understanding of ceramic typology, and we need really metadata analysis techniques to understand culture. The idea of culture as shared norms is adopted by cultural history, and that approach has been precisely used for creating various culture as presented by Professor Gurukal in this morning. We are not able to identify the communities behind these archaeologically or materially constructed cultures, and these are really the constructs of archaeologists. They are the constructs, and they are like ethic perception. We do not know how these people perceived themselves. But when we come to the historical period, we have a lot of literature which talks about the Sioux, Panis, and various groups, but we cannot identify these textual oriented identities in material culture. This is one of the problems we are facing. Thus, the Indus civilization, as perceived by archaeologists, has been constructed as a civilization. So we look at certain ceramic materials, ceramic forms, and typology. We construct it as a civilization. But recent research by several scholars have highlighted that Indus civilization not only had these urban settlers, it also had pastoralists and hunter-gatherers, as argued by Sudeshna Guha and several other researchers. So the notion of Indus civilization, when we hear this term, when we conceive this term as civilization, sometimes some people tend to think as it entirely as an urban or a kind of civilization. But when we look into the material culture, the number of sites, and the town planning and other features that are found in these sites, we know definitely that it was a kind of composite culture by incorporating multiple ethnic groups. This is a problem in which we need to research more to understand. The evidence of excavated site of Bahor in Rajasthan clearly suggests the interaction between microlithic using hunter-gatherers of Mewar region with the Indus civilization. Copper arrowheads have been excavated at this site. Similarly, some of the Chalcolithic cultures of Gujarat were also interacting with the Indus civilization. Indus civilization had multiple communities and groups interacting in this region. The authorship of Indus civilization and the theories have become still matter of debate. We are not yet able to completely understand this civilization. Perhaps we should visualize the Indus civilization as a composite culture that incorporated several groups and communities adopting different kinds of professions and occupation and means of subsistence. When we, as I said earlier, when we enter into the historical period using Vedic or other texts, we are able to see identities, and we are not able to correlate them with the material culture. There have been hunter-gatherers and food gatherers throughout the Indian history. When state formation took place, the state system had to interact and manage with many of these communities. The resources from the forest and forest as a space has been in great demand among the various communities that were living, and also among the empires that were forming. This is reflected in many of our textual sources, including Mahabharata and Ramayana. Ashokan inscription also refer to the way how he dealt with the people from the forest. So we have a lot of such evidence for the presence of hunter-gatherers in various contexts, right up to the contemporary period. In Andhra Pradesh, evidence for hunter-gatherer interactions in the Iron Age have been identified by Dr. M.L.K. Murthy. He has undertaken research on the ethnographic research on the Chinchus and several other communities, and it has been argued that these communities might have occupied this region right from the very early times, and they are also arguing for continuity of hunter-gatherers in the later period also. One of the arguments presented by some of the scholars have been the perceived forest people as primitive or as lost out the bus to progress or as unchanging. This idea of viewing the hunter-gatherers as unchanging and primitive is also problematic. There is a possibility to suggest the movement of hunter-gatherers in the historical times too. We have evidence of Telugu-speaking hunter communities living in Tamil Nadu. Some of them have moved into different potential resource areas like backwaters in the later period. So we should not see this historical hunter-gatherers being in a specific region constantly, right from the prehistoric time down to the later period. Now I will move on to my research in the Upper Gundar Basin. I'll share my PowerPoint here. I hope you can see my slides.
Yes, we can.
Right. Yeah, this is a map highlighting some of the microlithic sites found across India. This particular map is very important because it highlights that the Mesolithic communities were there almost in all over India, right from the time of early Holocene, and these communities formed the base population of India. My research in the Upper Gundar Basin in Madurai region has produced evidence for hunter-gatherers and pastoralists interacting in the Iron Age early historic period. The hunter-gatherers using microliths lived in the hill areas while the pastoral communities occupied the plain areas. I have also argued that some of the hunter-gatherers might have been displaced by the movement of agro-pastoral communities, and these communities who were using ceramics and iron implements were in fact advanced, and they may have displaced the hunter-gatherer communities. This is the area of Gundar Basin. You can see this town of Madurai. This is where Kiradi is. This is my research area where I did doctoral research. I worked on the prehistoric site as well as Iron Age sites, and this is the valley called Varshanada Andipatti Hill. This is Varshanada Andipatti Hill. This is Gundar River Basin, which there is a river called Gundar that drains towards the east and joins the Bay of Bengal. These are the sites that I have identified in these regions. What I found was I found evidence for settlements in the Mesolithic context all along in the central part of the basin. After the Iron Age, I could see the movement of hunter-gatherers into this particular fringe areas. Even today, we have evidence of Pali and hunter-gatherers living along these hills. I did some work on them. So probably from the Iron Age onwards, when the agro-pastoralist communities moved into the basin, these people moved beyond. This is a rock shelter at a site called Gobalapuram, where I have documented evidence of microliths and black and red ware datable to the Iron Age context. Several sites have been identified. These are some of the microlithic artifacts from these sites. And this is one site called S. Papinoyakanpatti. The site is near a very small hillock. Here we find evidence of microliths as well as Iron Age early historic habitation. Interestingly, we have these kind of settlements initially occupied by the Mesolithic communities, Microlithic using Mesolithic communities. Later on, when agro-pastoral communities moved into this region, we don't find any trace of these Mesolithic communities. So I did some excavate some trial trench at this site where we have evidence of burials as well as other materials. We found evidence of bone tools from the Iron Age early historic context and several other materials. I'll not highlight, especially at the bottommost layer, we have evidence for microliths as well as Mesolithic hunter-gatherer evidence. Then all of a sudden, then you have this Iron Age acropastoral communities evidence in the upper level. This site is especially in the center of the upper Gundar Basin. These are some of the faunal remains that I excavated in this site. This is an urn burial site. I also recovered a skeletal remain from this particular site, which was jointly studied by Walimbe and me. And here you can see in the center part of the upper Gundar Basin, you have a lot of Iron Age early historic settlement. And this is the hilly area where you find microlithic settlements, microlithic sites found along with black and red ware, clearly indicating that these hunter-gatherers might have moved into the fringe area and they were interacting with the agropastoral communities somewhere in the Iron Age early historic period. Okay, next I'll move on to the next section. Coming to my research in the Upper Gundar Basin, I have also studied the Palian hunter-gatherers, which has revealed some of the important archaeological sites used by the Palians in the historical period. For Palians, we don't have any written records or any other documents. The only way to understand the history of Palian hunter-gatherers is to collect oral information. Based on our research, we found several rock shelter sites with paintings which the Palians could identify as honey stones. And these people have memory of the sites that they occupied, and there are some kind of rock paintings found at all these sites. These paintings could be interpreted with the help of the Palians. If I had gone there as an outsider, I would have interpreted these paintings differently. With the kind of information that I gathered from the Palians, I could interpret them as the honey gathering scenes. Palians were very fond of honey gathering, and these people used to go for collecting honey mainly in the month of Tamil month of Thai, in the month of January, when honey is available in abundance. And they used to take risk of their lives in collecting honey, and this is a very common practice available among them. So the study of this particular community exposed several other rock shelter sites in the forest, dry deciduous forest areas, and some of the archaeological remains associated with them. And these Palians move in a group, and sometimes they also take other communities in their hunting gathering activities, and they also take their dogs for the hunting activities. And sometimes some of the burials associated with these Palians, they are not clearly distinguishable. Only because of their input, I could identify these sites. At these sites, we have mainly certain stones arranged in a fashion, and they don't show any perfect circular or other kind of features. So by exploring or working with Palians, I could understand many of these archaeological sites associated with them. Now, I will move on to the Sangam literature and the evidence from Sangam literature, which talks about the hunter-gatherers. So in order to understand these hunter-gatherers, we need to also look into the literature, early historic Sangam age literature as well as medieval literature, which gives us a lot of ideas. If you are looking into the archaeological remains alone, we have a lot of megalithic burial sites with a lot of black and red ware. When we are trying to look at these sites, we cannot understand the cultural variation within the megalithic ceramics. We have a lot of ceramics, they look exactly identical over a vast area. It is very difficult to understand the minute identities that existed among the megalithic, so-called megalithic people. The same way as Indus civilization has been constructed by archaeologists, the Iron Age culture or the megalithic culture or clearly constructs created by archaeologists. If you want to break these constructs, get into the minute aspects of the cultural aspects, we need to definitely look into the early literature. When we look at the Tamil literature, we have a lot of reference to these hunter-gatherer communities. The communities that relied upon hunting are described as Kanavar. Kan means forest people, Yeiner, Vetuvar, hunter, and other labels are presented in this literature. As far as social formation in the early historic Tamilagam is concerned, Professor Rajan Gurukal has extensively worked on this, and I would like to highlight some of these references related to these hunter-gatherers. Natchinai poem mentions about a hunter who hunted various resources such as iguana and frog, termites, and wild hare. Purananuru poem 33 refers to a hunter who, with a dog, lived in the forest and exchanged venison for the produce of pastoralists and farmers. Paditrupattu mentions about a Vetuvar person with a murderous bow, exchanging the meat of the deer with the pastoral and farming communities for rice and curd. They were hunting animals and exchanged the meat for various other produce with the agropastoral groups. Thus, the complex exchange relationship involving food and other resources in the region from the hill to coast are presented in the Sangam literature, which also deals with the 5 different landscapes. I'll not go into the details now. And we have several such references. If we look into these references very deeply, we get a clear understanding how these hunters function, a kind of understanding that we cannot achieve just by looking at the archaeological record alone. For example, Akananuru talks about a hunter with a dog. Akananuru 36 refers to hunter who uses fishing rod to catch fish. Hunter who remains hidden in a bush while hunting, that is mentioned in Akananuru. Hunters and hunting dogs are mentioned in Kalitogai. Fish hunters on a boat called the fisher folk are also described. Hunter who commits murder. Actually, that is how, especially in the literature of Manimekalai, Buddhist literature, a hunter is seen as a person committing murder. So these kind of terminology, and also they describe these people as Kalla. Kalla in the sense illiterate or uneducated, or people who do not have, the poets perceive them as having a kind of different understanding, not advanced knowledge as presented in the text. Vetuvan, who was an expert in killing animal, spread the net for catching wild pigeon that managed to escape the net. So these kind of descriptions are presented in the literature. Vetuvan, who uses a decoy bird for trapping birds, that is also presented in Natchinai. Hunter who blow horns and have dogs with the prey. They are catching them in the, through their mouth, and they hunt the deer. Vetuvan caught iguana, frog, termites, and wild hare, and drinks toddy. Vetuvan with murderous bow exchanged the meat of deer for the and tusk of elephant for toddy. An expert hunter with extraordinary hills in using bow and arrow. That is how this literature talks about these hunters. So we do get several such references to these hunters. It is very much possible that these people who were living in the forest were also actively supplying commodities for the so-called Indo-Roman trade. So these communities were very much important in collecting the forest produce for the larger market exchange as part of Indian Ocean or early historic Indo-Roman trade network. We also have evidence of Roman coins in some of the burials from the Nilgiri megaliths. So therefore, when we look at the literature, we get a very clear understanding how these hunter communities were predominant in certain region, how they were actively, working in collecting the resources from the landscape, and also we have references to several other communities, hunters, sometimes plundering, and they were involved in cattle lifting. and these people were also involved in cattle lifting. This could be one of the method for acquiring resources through which these communities would have adopted agro-pastoralism. So we have a lot of hero stones of the later period, and they also reveal about Vetuvas as a community involving in these kind of cattle lifting activities. So when we look at the literature and see the archaeological materials in association, we are better able to understand the complexities and the social organization involved in. We have the references to the famous Kannappa Nayanar, who was a hunter, and he became part of the Bhakti movement, and his images are found in many of the temples in Tamil Nadu. Similarly, we also find Tirupanalvar created to the Vaishnavite faith, and we do get these people gradually being incorporated into the mainstream society. There are also reference to panas in the Sangam literature. I am not going to present all the details because I have limited time. We have detailed reference to panas who involved in fishing and who were camping nearby the river Vaigai. So we get extensive references, and in the later period, we also have references to other kind of saints who were associated with the either different communities. They were being incorporated in the mainstream temple festivals. For example, in the temple of Ambal near Pundotam near Tiruvarur, there is a story associating Pulaya with the worship of Shiva. So these kind of myths and also Puranas, they refer to is incorporating hunters and other communities. And Periya Puranam text is very important in this regard. Coming to this medieval literature, Sundara also was involved
Professor
in
Selvakumar,
kind of.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you please speak towards your mic, facing
Okay,
your
okay,
mic?
okay, right. Coming to this medieval literature, we have Sundarar referring to the Vetuvas, and once Sundarar was traveling towards Tamil Nadu in somewhere in the Kongu region, he was attacked by the Vetuvas, and he records this in one of his poems. So when we look at this literature, we get a lot of such reference to these hunter-gatherers and hunters. They were involved in different kind of activities, and sometimes they are also incorporated into the mainstream societies. But when we deal with the medieval periods, all the hunters were not of the same conditions. We have certain people of hunter caste who had transformed and who had an important position in administration. So here we cannot think of these hunters having a very identical condition. Rather, we could see this emerging into a caste wherein some of these community members achieved a dominant position, and they were part of the administration, while some of them were involved in hunting gathering activities. There are also inscriptions which refer to the community of Valayas who were forced to give white hair as a tax rather than in the 15th century. There is a reference in a Pudukkottai inscription that talks about the Valayas giving wild hair which they hunted as a kind of tax. Similarly, other communities offered chicken. So we get a lot of such references to these hunter groups in the dry areas in between the fertile riverine areas. Similarly, there are references to fisher folk also in the literature, and also in the inscriptions. We have reference to fisher folk offering donation for worshipping Adipatha Nayanar in the temple of Tirukuvalai. And also there are some Vetuvas offering donation to a temple in North Arcad for performing worship to Kannappa Nayana. And we also have references to Irulas in the later periods. Irulas as a communities, they are found in the Vedaranyam backwater area. Some are found near Chidambaram in the Pichavaram areas. Probably these communities moved into this region in the later period because of the potential water resources as well as the marine resources available in the Pichavaram area. So when we look into the medieval inscriptions, we get a lot of such references. So I'll come to the main point of my presentation. So what I am trying to argue through my presentation is that we need to have a kind of holistic approach in studying Indian culture. Sometimes because of the rich material culture, we tend to focus on Indus Valley or Harappan civilization, while other regional cultures are not given due representation. As for archaeologists and historian is concerned, I think we need to give more focus to understanding these regional cultures, studying the regional cultures and hunter-gatherer adaptation, and these other communities require archaeologically to investigate. We need more financial assistance in terms of undertaking scientific research. This is where I would like to argue in terms of heritage management policy of the central government as well as the state government. They need to have clear allocation of funds for undertaking research, and our aim should be not only on the Aryans or Dravidians or Indus civilization, rather to understand the cultures of India. This is where I feel micro history or village history becomes important. We have excavated a lot of sites across India. We need to find a way using artificial intelligence or metadata analysis to interpret this particular data set so that we can understand the cultural development of India in a holistic manner. As we know, when we look at the archaeological evidence, it is very clear India as a country is pluralistic in nature. Multiple cultural traditions have constituted the diverse nature of the Indian culture, and this needs to be further researched. These are some of the main points of my presentation. I hope I am within the limit of the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Selvakumar. You have been able to make a very important point, and this point is this: that through your study of hunter-gatherers, you have been able to show that their history can be traced even before the Indus Valley civilization and can be continued throughout the historical period. And the fact that some of the time that we link these hunter-gatherers with our focus on Aryan or Dravidian or Indus civilization is slightly, I think, wrong, according to you. This is a very, very important point. And in addition to that, you have raised certain question about the archaeological policy, about the question of how we should consider culture, particularly the importance of regional culture. And with your study of the Palian hunter-gatherers as well as the study of the Sangam period, you have been able to show that they were hunter-gatherers, but in addition to that, some of them were agro-pastoralists also. So before actually opening this paper to the questions, I have one question to you, and this is this, that if you take the history of hunter-gatherers from the archaeological time to the historical time, in this long perspective, the civilizational perspective, then how do you consider that their relationship with the peasants, the agrarian settlements, which was continuously expanding? And these hunter-gatherers, either they stayed in the hills or in the forests. So their relationship, the peasants' relationship, the peasant settlements' expanding relationship with these places, hills and forests, have to be taken up also. And how would you react to this? This is my humble question.
With the expansion of agrarian way of life, some of the hunter-gatherers, we cannot say that hunter-gatherers remain static. Some of the hunter-gatherers probably were influenced by these new developments and they were transformed. while some of them, only some of them were, they moved into the marginalized areas. So I think the process was, it's very complex. We have these hunter-gatherer communities, and some of them in the pristine area, forest area, who moved into the remote areas. When I made an interview to the Pali, and they said that they moved into this forest because they did not want to pay tax. So there could be several compulsion that led to the movement of these communities in different areas. Some of the communities, I think they were probably impoverished, and some of them, if you look at the Sangam literature, some of these Pulayas were involved in funerary rituals. I think this idea of professional hunter-gatherers who probably took up the labor services. This is one of the transformation. Some of the hunter-gatherers might have taken up labor services, and because they become impoverished. If you look at the literature, you find these people depending upon the patronage of the chiefs and kings of the Sangam age. So we should see this as a kind of multilineal development, not as a single development. Some of the communities, they moved into the remote areas where there was no agrarian population. Some of them, they became part of the system. They probably supplied the labor service, and some of them took up, as we have literary evidence to suggest, they became the ritual service providers. If you look at the Panas, they were good in singing, they were composing poems. So these people were doing that. The literature also tells that these people were involved in fishing. Gradually, what happened when there was agrarian expansion, even after the Pallava period, probably there was a shortage of resources available for the hunter-gatherers in the main area. As a result of agricultural expansion and tank irrigation, and the landscape changed. Also, pastoralism expanded. This naturally forced them to choose some other occupation. Some of them might have chosen to agropastoralism. Some of them might have chosen to agricultural labor service, or otherwise some of them would have moved into the remote area. So we could see kind of multi-level changes, multilineal changes taking place in the lives of hunter-gatherers in the historical period.
Okay. Thank you. I think if there are some questions from the audience.
Yes.
Mahalakshmi, can you?
Yeah. Yes. We have 3 very interesting questions from Dr. Vishnupriya Basak. The first is, can you please highlight the problematics in the ways in which an archaeologist uses analogies from the ethnographic present, as you were referring to this in your presentation? The second question is about your emphasis on digital methods. And while she appreciates it, she says that also, don't you think there should be a greater engagement with the public without seeing the public as a monolithic category? Sorry, these are 2 different things that she's pointing out here. And the last point that she makes is, should we not have a more critical understanding of heritage instead of seeing it as a sum total of information of the past?
With regard to the analogical argument, I think we need to be, we cannot use analogical argument in all the contexts. Sometimes what happens is, the contemporary communities are taken to, exist as it is without any kind of changes. And this is one of the problem of our approach. Analogical argument has a lot of problem because the context in which we are applying this information could be problematic. So what I am trying to say is that that we can get some kind of understanding from by studying these communities, and we can get some kind of middle range understanding as postulated by Binford in order to interpret the past communities rather than taking a direct analogy. For example, many people have argued these forest communities have lived in this region from the early time. So this is problematic because these communities have migrated in between, and we need to undertake further research. This is the first question, and the second question is about uh, what was the second question? Can I read them here?
Yeah, it's there in the chat box. There should be a greater engagement with the public without seeing the public as a monolithic category.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that. We see when we look at the public, as there are different categories of public. There are some people, who try to visualize this from a very imaginative point of view. Some people who try to see this as a matter of pride, and we cannot see public as one kind of group, because within the public there are several groups who also work on the basis of their own local interests. Because the public, when we talk about public, it is a general, but these communities, these people, they have their own interests and personal interests in their in their village and society. So any kind of views that we present, they do not want it to be affected. Sometime when we deal with these history right of kind of questions, we also get right to information from the public. So they want to prove certain things, saying that, for example, who were the descendants of this particular king. So when we cannot take public as a same level, we have among the public some people with some kind of interest, with some kind of agenda they want to put. We have another side, we have some people with a kind of who wants to understand heritage in a plain perspective. So we cannot deal with them in the same level, because some of the public, they want to use historical knowledge for their own purpose or their own agenda. So we have these people are also in the public. So when we talk about public, it is not single categories. There are a lot of variations, a lot of people with a different kind of motives and intention. So what I am talking in terms of public is the general public who are interested in learning about the past, and we need to really engage more, especially in Tamil Nadu. Sometimes people tend to have a very strong feeling about certain things. We try to create mm, awareness. We try to create awareness. For example, there are so many issues with regard to the authorship of Indus Valley civilization or Kumari Kandam. There are certain notions in the minds of people. So what we need to do is to to present the accurate or so-called version of history. We need to educate them, I feel, because in the name of history, what we find in social media, in others, there are so much of wrong data and interpretation presented. I think this is where archaeologists and historians need to work to create a kind of understanding what is the uh, kind of history that can be presented based on the available evidence. And otherwise, now there are several interested individuals who proclaim themselves as historians or archaeologists, or claim, because archaeology is fun or history is fun. But it is very important that we teach very accurate information. Accurate in the sense, I am not trying to say it is absolute objective kind of history. Some kind of history that is acceptable based on available evidence. Finally, coming to the data analytics and metadata analytics, artificial intelligence, you are right, I agree with her. We need to change the problems. That is the main thing. How we define culture, how we understand culture. So the problem lies with archaeological theorizing. So when we theorize this culture and understanding properly, then when we use this technology, it will be easy, because as I see that we look at the material culture, we look at the diverse variety of material culture from the excavated sites. How are we going to understand the material culture? Because we have voluminous data which is impossible to understand using our own brain and our own cognitive understanding. This is where I feel combining with the theoretical understanding of culture and defining culture, we need to have this metadata analysis. I agree with Vishnupriya that both are essential.